Welcome to episode 6 of Just Cause, the podcast of the Just Love Collective. I'm Dilys, and I'm glad you've joined us for this conversation.
And I'm Nathan, and yes, Dilys, we have quite a conversation to jump into today.
Our dialogue partners brought stories that are rich, challenging, and beautiful. Stories that call to mind Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's seminal TED Talk, The Danger of a Single Story. This episode is about the power of knowing and reclaiming our stories, especially for Indigenous and Pacifica peoples.
Our first guest has already contributed to this season of Just Cause. Moy Stiles is part of the leadership team of the Just Love Collective, and of Samoan heritage, she is pastor of Crosswalk Melbourne and chaplain to the Seventh-day Adventist University students at public universities in Melbourne, Australia.
Rosaline Parker is a prominent Pacifica advocate, cultural consultant, and community leader based in Western Sydney, Australia. Also of Samoan heritage, she is dedicated to empowering Pacifica diaspora communities and advocating for climate justice, working with organizations including MICA Australia, the Pacific Women's Collective, and The Root Crop, her grassroots initiative focused on community engagement and action.
We will be back at the end of this episode with a challenge reflecting on our conversation, but we begin by inviting Moy and Rosaline to introduce themselves to us, particularly in relation to their cultural backgrounds.
Hi friends, my name is Moy Stiles. I am of Pacifica heritage, specifically Samoan. I was born and raised there for about 10 years and then have spent most of my life in Australia and a stint in New Zealand as well. I currently work as a pastor for Crosswalk Melbourne, and I also look after university students and currently reside on Wurundjeri country here in Victoria, and it's good to be able to join you once again. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Moy. And Rosaline, please introduce yourself to us and our many, many listeners.
Thank you. Tala Falava. My name is Rosaline. Most people just call me Rose. I was born in Tamaki Makaurau, Aotearoa, but I have spent most of my life living here on Darug Nation, here in Western Sydney, in Australia. I am of Pacifica heritage, proud Samoan. And my day job, so I currently work as the Pacific Australian Emerging Leaders Network Program Manager with MICA Australia, but also do a lot with our Pacific community here in the diaspora. Thank you for having me.
That's cool, thank you. So we want to ask you some questions about your specific parts of the world, but let's begin with talking about culture. And one of the things we talk about at times in this discussion is that our engagement with justice is often shaped by our cultural identities. And this becomes more obvious when it is kind of situated amongst groups that are minority cultures or, outside different from the dominant culture. When we become aware of how we are shaped by our cultures, how can we sort of use this as something that we can all benefit from in our engagement with the work of justice?
I truly believe that in order to solve many of the issues that are happening in the world, it is important that we put the voices of those on the margins at the forefront. So as we know, those who are facing a lot of injustice across the globe right now, a lot of them are from diverse backgrounds, of different cultural groups. And I think it's really important for them to be leading the change and to be given the opportunity. A lot of the time, we are still working through very colonial frameworks that unfortunately do not understand our Indigenous peoples and the way that we've always practiced problem solving for many years. For example, in Samoa, we have a saying, which pretty much refers to the ways we may do things may change over time, but the foundations always remain the same. We have our village way of maintaining social cohesion, and I feel that obviously across the world, a lot of the people look at our people as if we didn't have all these answers and we weren't living harmoniously the way we were before colonization. So I really think it's important to have solutions that are culturally driven and to ensure that we don't just look at just diversity, but genuine intercultural inclusion in relation to solving these issues or working towards a more just world, because it is our communities that are always doing the groundwork anyway. Thank you.
Yeah, I love that. I was just thinking, Rose, as you were speaking, there's also another saying, or at least my dad used to always say to me when I was growing up, e loale tene Samoa lana tu lananga. And it's this idea that you know a Samoan girl by the way that she stands and lives and dresses. Like, there's this idea that the way that you show up in the world is not just parts of you, it's who you are. And especially as, and I can only speak of being a Samoan, how we navigate the world is within that context as well as our faith context. The way that we show up in the world is not just in it's our physical being, obviously. And that in itself indicates, that you are from somewhere. And you show up with that in that body and in that space, but also the way that you were raised, your environment and culture has a lot to do with that. But I also think your identity has a lot to do with that. I was actually having this conversation just a few days ago and someone asked me, how do you navigate the world, and also serve in your capacity as a Samoan woman? I'm like, that is what informs what I do half of the time. That is the context in which I was brought up. And so therefore you cannot divorce or separate a person from their environment. And I guess as we're talking about culture, I mean, there's a lot of cultures that we can talk about. And I guess in this context, we're talking about our heritage, our ancestry, our makeup, and, Rosaline and I come from, we are Samoan diaspora, we live in Australia, our heritage is Samoan, we represent the Pacifica as well, and not just Australia, New Zealand, but Pacific Islands in general. And so I think with that in mind, how do we show up then? And what part of who we are influence and inform the way that we serve in our workspace, in our faith context, in our family dynamics. And it all comes back to that worldview or that perspective or that context of being in our context, being a Samoan. And so how does that impact or how should that show up? I think it should have everything to do with, respecting the fact that that's where we are and who we are. One of the things that, and again, I think back on the question that was asked of me, I go, I look at the world, and on one hand, I have been educated in New Zealand and Australia, predominantly Australia. So there is a particular framework in which I have been educated, and it's amazing, and I'm so grateful for that. But I also look at that framework, but there's a layer of my Samoanness that I've put to it, because I always am looking through my Samoan eyes, but also as a daughter of God and also as a person of faith within the Adventist context, in a Christian context. So all of those layers impact the way that those are the lenses in which I look at the world. And I think that's not unique to me. That is everybody that is Indigenous or everybody that comes from a diverse background. And I think for a long time, my own decolonizing work hit me a few years ago when I was like, wow, I've only ever kind of operated from this framework, and I have kind of shelved my upbringing, who I am as a Samoan woman navigating the world in Australia and then other parts of the world. And so I've had to bring that back and say, what values, does my Indigenous voice have, what do I have to contribute to the world from this perspective? And I think I am so grateful to have asked that question, because I've had to reclaim that, because for a long time I've had to shelve it and only ever operate with the lens of, well, I'm in Australia now, and that doesn't have anything to do with what I do, but it has everything to do with who I am and what I do and how I navigate the world. So, yeah.
I think I'm struck by how both of you have used this term, decolonize, and I don't know um, if 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 for some listeners that word or that term might be new or might be challenging. And what I'm hearing from both of you is your lived experience and cultural identities have been such a large part of your life, even as you have lived in a majority culture that is Australian or New Zealand. And I hear you both saying it's not an either or, it's a both and. So could you just, what has it cost you anything to do that kind of work, Rose? Of navigating spaces of being both Samoan and Australian, being both Samoan, Australian, Christian, are those, I hear you all saying it's not mutually exclusive, but I'm wondering, when we talk about decolonization, what do we mean? And then is there a cost to doing that?
Yes, definitely. So I guess in my context, the way that I look at it is taking apart all the layers, the colonial constructs that have been forcibly put onto our people and populations across the globe. Um, I'll be completely honest with you. In my experience as a Samoan diaspora, whilst I have also been trying to go through the process of indigenizing myself, I'm also mindful that, of course, there are difficulties. Living here in the modern world, living in a suburban place, it's definitely quite different to the village lifestyle that my family has back home. But in saying that, I definitely feel empowered to be partaking in the decolonial process, especially because I have found that I have more of a voice um, since I've been able to kind of go through this process and this journey. And the reason why that I say that is because, for the Pacific Islands and many places across the world, it was people from Britain who did introduce in the context of Samoa, the London Missionary Society, which is the church that I've branched off from. And there's beautiful history there, and there's also not so great history there. And then a lot of the things in our culture that has changed over the time. It wasn't until that I decided to do my own education and look things up. I was like, wow, this is the reason why, we don't do these practices anymore, because we were forced not to, because it wasn't seen as pure or not valued enough. And then I guess learning those kinds of things, I was like, wow, like this is the way that we were seen. When I know in my heart the way that I feel as a Samoan woman, like it's the most beautiful thing in the world to me. Um, and that's a feeling that I want, especially our young people in the diaspora. I want them to experience that, because once they know themselves, they can excel in all ways, and also bring themselves out a lot of the trenches that a lot of our community are currently in. Yeah, it's definitely a big process, and there's a lot of uncomfortable truths that we have to face, and even calling out behaviors within our own families. I know sometimes the things that I talk about my family are like, "Wow, you're so woke," or they don't fully understand, and it's because they haven't gone on the same journey that I have gone on, and you know what, that's okay, but it's always baby steps to get there, and it's even just through the simple things like understanding, guys, because of climate change, we're going to lose our plants. And if we lose our plants, we can't have our beautiful tapa mats anymore. And, when you explain those kind of things in that slow and easy to process kind of way, are people kind of like, oh, really? Like, is that actually what's happening? Because those messina or those treasures are very important to us. And it's when we remember those different elements, then our people can feel more connected. But yeah, there are definitely challenges that I go through, especially, in the workplace and across different spaces, because I'll be honest, like a lot of people in Australia, they're not ready to hear some of the things, some of the struggles that our people go through. They just view us, happy islander people, always resilient. And our people are, like, even through the hardest times, our people always have a smile on their face. They're so prayerful in all that they do. But there are big problems and challenges that we do need to unpack. And it's going to be a continuous journey, but I feel that God's got us in this, and I can see even through platforms such as this, it's also a way for us to share our story. Thank you.
Yeah, I think over the last, it's not a new conversation, this idea of decolonization, but I remember a few years ago, I read the book from, oh my word, Chimamanda Ngozi. And it's the book Americana. And it has nothing to do with, well, it has everything to do with decolonizing, and also it doesn't specifically talk about this, right? But it was so fascinating reading that book because there were examples of this. It's a novel, and it's an example of this girl that came from Nigeria, yeah, and she comes to America and she lives her life. And there are these practices that you do as someone that has come from a place like Nigeria. And I couldn't help myself but putting myself in her place, but as a Samoan. And I remember reading this book, I'm like, oh my word, we did exactly the same thing. Like, it was something really simple as when I first moved to New Zealand from Samoa with my family, we were used to washing our clothes, when we shower, for instance. And I remember as a kid, as a high schooler, going to my friend's house, and I felt really disgusted because she didn't wash her clothes straight away. She put her clothes this is so simple, right? But she put her clothes in a washing basket, and then she would wait. It might be a week, it might be 2 weeks, it might be, a month before she does her washing. And in my Samoan mind, I was like, that is so disgusting. As a Samoan, I'm like, we were brought up to wash our clothes straight away because it's dirty. And it's something so simple as that, because I remember thinking, oh, wait, I don't do that anymore. I actually am the girl who puts her clothes in a washing basket and I wait to wash my clothes all at once, and so there's no wrong or right about this, but it's a practice. And I remember reading this book and thinking about all of the different ways that I have now shown up in the world and the practices, the way that I think about things. And I remember putting that book down and thinking to myself, there is some undoing and unlearning that I need to do, And it was so confronting because then I kind of went down a deep dive and I sort of unpacked a few things. And one of them is to do with academics and theology. I remember thinking about all the theologians that I would quote. And there's nothing wrong with all of the theologians that I would quote. But I started to look at who I was quoting, who I was reading, who I have been encouraged to listen to. And I can tell you, like, none of them were Pacific Islanders. None of them were, none of them were people of color theologians. Again, nothing wrong with that, but everything wrong with that. Because for me, what was so confronting was that the way that my theology was shaped, the way that my thinking is shaped, and the way that I preach, and all of these thought processes, it was only ever by a certain group of theologians. And I remember, like, again, kind of doing a deep dive and go, we have some incredible theologians. Why haven't I heard of them? Why aren't they being taught in my theology classes? Why aren't they in my church's, theological institutions and, in our Bible studies? Why aren't their voices being centered as well as saying they have something worthwhile to contribute to theology. Like, God is working with our Indigenous people and our Samoan people and our Pacific Island, academics just as much. Why aren't they? And so it's kind of this idea of decolonization is a process of, I guess, unpacking, undoing some of the colonial work and systems that are currently placed that we have benefited from, but also have silenced a lot of our incredible Indigenous voices. And so, yeah, this work of decolonization is so confronting, but also so freeing as well, because in some ways it's a reclamation of our voices. And it's this idea that God is at work everywhere, and that our Indigenous people, our Pacific Island people, like, again, when I was going down this rabbit hole, I was like, why wasn't liberation theology, being taught when I was going through my, undergrad? Why didn't I hear the South American voice? Why didn't I hear like Black theology? Anyway, it was a whole thing, but it was really confronting. And so when we talk about decolonization, it isn't throwing the baby out with the bathwater kind of situation. It is this examination of, why aren't other voices being invited in? Why aren't our curriculums, for instance, including the diversity of voices rather than just, one group of voices that we have deemed to be the authority on all things? And so, anyway, and I know that that's its own challenge and dangerous space to sort of speak into, but I guess in some ways, the reason I am mentioning all of that is, I remember my dad used to say, I want you to have a white brain, as if white people are the only people with incredible thoughts. And when he used to say that to me, it was to say, I want you to be smart like white people. And I love my white people. We have a very smart white person in this chat, and I'm very, very grateful for that wisdom and intelligence. But I now look back on it and go, but Dad, what about Black brain? What about brown brain? Aren't they worthy of exploring as well? Aren't they worthy of listening to and being, to learn from as well? So anyway, I could go on, but that's a whole thing.
And even in your answer there, Moy, you've touched upon, people and voices from all over the world. You've taken us to South America and to, in the process of, even wrestling with your own cultural, so that's a fascinating excursion right there. How does your culture direct you in what you choose and prioritize amongst all those different things? Neither of you, as remarkable women as you are superhuman. We only have so much attention, we only have so much energy, we only have so much time. How do you prioritize the justice causes, the justice issues, the justice opportunities that you engage with?
That's a really important question. I genuinely believe that justice issues across the world are deeply interconnected. So even though they may not touch my life directly, the conflict in the Middle East, for example, that is impacting the cost of petrol here, as well as decisions made in the White House that will impact the future of our extended families in American Samoa. So really across the world, whether it's climate, race, gender, social equality, these issues are very much interwoven together across borders and across different societies. While I may not be able to, give $1 million to donate or find a cure for a disease, I still believe that we can always contribute in a meaningful way somehow, whether that's sharing a post or attending an event, amplifying a story. I believe that these are all forms of solidarity that are important. One thing that I really do enjoy doing, for example, there is a event that we're holding next week the focus is climate and advocacy, as well as education for Pacific diaspora communities. I know that you guys were probably aware of the conflict in Palestine. So we have a group that are coming to showcase on the day. They are a Pacific group, but they're called Pacifica for Palestine. So they very much stand in solidarity with communities in Palestine, because we believe that, everyone should have, human rights. And at the same time, across the Pacific, there are people also experiencing genocide, violence, and issues as such. So we want to bring communities together, marginalized communities, in order to spread awareness, but also very much, in the true way of God, bring people together in any way that we can, even though we know that there are so many different things going on. A collective response is always a successful response. But I also, in saying that, I'm also mindful, and I want to be completely honest, especially as a daughter of the Pacific Ocean, I will always prioritize and uplift our region. We're often known as like the forgotten Pacific. Our struggles are rarely known at the global stage, and sometimes not even known to each other. An example of this is in Australia, for example. Throughout the entire education system here, you'll never learn about the Pacific Islands, even though they're so close by. And everyone goes to Fiji for a holiday, or they go to their cruise to the South Pacific, to Vanuatu and New Caledonia. Yet there is an ongoing conflict in New Caledonia right now, and there are a lot of tourists going there, but I don't see anyone speaking about it. So it's really important for me to amplify the voices of our people. Another thing as well is a lot of people here in Australia don't realize that the Indigenous peoples of ZFS, so the Torres Strait Islands, they're actually Pacific Islanders as well. They're Indigenous Melanesian people. But I could probably walk down my street and ask my neighbors, and none of them would know that. So I think it's really important that the Pacific gets the same spotlight as ancient Rome and ancient Greece, because unfortunately we're not really well known, but we're a very important part of the world, and I think that we deserve our time to have our stories amplified. So yes, that's something I'm very passionate about. Thank you.
Yeah,
I'm actually really grateful to have met Rose, because in the almost year that I've gotten to know her, I think I am a lot more aware, and not just, because of you, Rose, and also some of our young people that I met through Pales. And I guess it's a journey that I've sort of gone on over the last couple of years. I talk about the reclaiming side of our Pacific and our, Pacific Island voices, but also issues. Because it's really easy for me to be outraged, which I have been, by the way. Like, how do you prioritize which issues that you get enraged about? And I try not to get enraged, because it's not helpful at times, but, it spurs me on to think about other people's stuff. But it's really easy for me to be influenced by what I read, what I'm seeing, everything that is highlighted, and forget, like you're saying, Rose, there is so much going on within our region that we don't often think about. Like, because of knowing some Papuans, we think about the West Papuans and their struggle for liberation, but that's not often highlighted. It's only known within a very small, group of people, but it's in our region. It's the South Pacific, includes Australia, New Zealand, and it's a vast ocean, and so there are these issues that I think I want to bring to the forefront a lot more than it has been. Because again, I've been outraged about what's happening in Palestine. I have this poster, in my house at the moment, and it was part of a protest that I went to for Palestine. But it is of Mandela, where he says the liberation of, talking about South Africans at the time, is tied to the freedom and liberation of Palestinians. But I think that saying actually goes, that it's applicable to our South Pacific people and our islanders, that whilst we live in this global world and this global village, we often forget that there are things happening within our oceans that we're not highlighting and we're not prioritizing. And I think it's time that we bring that in, like you were talking about New Caledonia. And, we have incredible young leaders who are showing up at the UN, continuing to highlight what's happening with, Kanaki, for instance, or the Marshall Islands. So many things that are often put to very much the background because of majority culture or, dominant culture, for instance. So how do we prioritize it? And I think, Nathan, I know that you talk about how, yes, we can focus on all of the big things happening in the world, but we've got issues here for our First Nations people, the fight for increasing the age of criminality, that, we have our states who are saying, yes, we need to jail 10-year-olds. And so all of these other issues that are happening right now within our reach, what if that becomes something that, because it's impacting the people right next to us, that sit next to us in churches as well. So anyway.
I think that's an important thing when we, sometimes one of the things that's thrown at justice advocates is the idea that, you're just being trendy, or you're being reactive to what the media is feeding you, or what the social media algorithms are feeding you, or whatever. And that's where I think it is so valuable to just, there are some things, because of who we are, because of our life experiences, our culture, as we've mentioned, or whatever that might be, our place in the world, that there are some things that we'll maintain a focus on because we are uniquely positioned to be voices on those issues, and that we'll be talking about them even when it's not trendy, and even when it's not in the headlines, and even because those issues are still there and still vitally important. And I think to some degree that's actually one of the key definitions of a justice advocate, to be someone who is focused on just loving. I think I just invented a new verb. But to be people that will just keep doing the boring stuff and keep talking and educating and raising an issue even when it's not trendy and when everybody else isn't talking about it. There are important things that everybody is talking about that we should be concerned about, but there are also those other things as well, and I think that's pretty significant. I have a specific question for you, Moy, as a pastor. You have a little bit of a reputation for being outspoken on some of these issues. How do you balance the role of being a pastor and a leader with your passion for justice?
Well, as Sister Dilys said much earlier, and what we've alluded to in this kind of work, it's like they're not divorced from each other, right? To do just to the work of a pastor, how do I not get involved in justice work? How do I not speak to the injustices of the world when the whole of Scripture is filled with ways in which God intervened and interceded in the lives of humans? If we were to use the sacred text that we often use for these conversations. And so for me as a pastor, how do I balance it? I mean, it's a given. It's a given that if we are to be faithful in our work as ministers of the gospel, then the good news of the gospel is that we have a God that loves people, and that he is about doing, righting the wrongs of the world, and so therefore it's not so much balancing it. It is you just you do the work because this is part of your calling. It is core to my, or at least I can only speak from this is core gospel ministry work. It is not divorced from each other, and I think to be a faithful leader and to be a faithful pastor, I can't not engage and I can't not do this work. If I'm going, that's the thing.
That's cool. Well, as my pastor, thank you, Moy.
I love it.
Cool.
Yeah, I think even as we're asking Moy about it in her role as a pastor. Rose, for you as someone who is not clergy, what inspires you to tell the stories and to get involved and to speak up? What allows you to get to see that connection?
I think for me, um, it's interesting because we talk about decolonization, but my genealogy, there is some colonization that happened there. So one thing that I've always been passionate about since I was a young girl was knowing where I come from.
Mm.
I'm a mixed race Pacific Islander, so growing up in Sydney and going to school where there's a few Pacific Islanders here and there, I was not accepted. They were just like, you are different, you look different, you act different.
Mm.
And then I was like, why? But I feel like in my heart, I feel like I'm someone. Like, isn't that enough?
Mm.
And then, and I believe God just does these things for a reason, right? So I started to do a lot of genealogy tracking and learning more about where I come from and where my ancestors come from. And on my mother's side, my great grandfather, he's actually a Chinese indentured laborer. So he was a slave that was brought to Samoa to work in the plantations by the Germans at the time because we were colonized by Germany. And then on the other side of my ancestry, I do have links to the Cook Islands, where one of my ancestors was the daughter of a king, and she married a Scottish man, and then they were operating a plantation in Kiribati. So like learning the stories and the histories of where I come from, both the sad parts and obviously the positive parts as well. I think, wow, like all of these people, they went through a lot just for me to be where I am today. For example, my grandmother, she's from Savai'i, she couldn't speak a word of English, and she was living in a housing commission home here in Western Sydney, and would try and find a way just to make it to church. She couldn't speak English, but she was trying to catch the bus and do all of that just so she could make it to church, so she could give all her money to church because she loved God so much. And all of the sacrifices that these people went through, the struggles for me to be here today, and yet for me to have this great education that I've been blessed with, the opportunities that I have today. I can't just let that go and not think about those before me, the struggles that happened then, but the fact that even in today's society, the struggles are still continuing. Yeah, it doesn't sit well with me. So I know that I've been blessed with this voice, and the privilege to know where I come from. Some people are being exiled from their islands and they're not allowed to go back. So I will do what I can to uplift them and support them.
I love that.
That's beautiful, Rose. Thank you for sharing your story. And I think it goes back to what the through line of this whole broadcast so far, this conversation so far, Nathan, about you cannot separate culture and identity and lived experience
Mm.
from this work of justice that, um, which is what Jesus embodied, right? Jesus becomes human
Mm.
Mm.
to experience with us what it means to be human and then show us the way to be human.
Mm.
And
Mm.
that's a conversation for another day.
We often talk about proximity as an element of justice work.
Hmm.
But almost in the conversation we're having here, it works the other way. There's because of proximity, we must do the justice work.
That's right.
And that's why the two topics are so interrelated in that way.
Yeah.
Mm. Yeah.
What's coming up for me as I'm thinking about your Pacifica identities and how it's shaping the way that you engage with justice is um, why must the church engage with with justice? Like, what would you say to someone who, if they were sitting here and saying, "Hey, I hear what you're saying, but the church has no business getting involved in justice work"? How would you both respond to that?
uh, I mean, if we know our history, we know that the church has experienced, over its own history and development. If we're talking about the church as a collective and a group of people that have tried to follow this rabbi called Jesus, then they know that the church has gone through its own justice challenges, where they have experienced what it means to be on the margins, to be executed for, loving people and wanting to share the good news of the gospel about a God that says that everybody is made in the image of God. And so and I guess it's that whole question, how do we not engage? If anything, this is core work to, when we talk about salvation, often it's individualistic salvation. But what if salvation is the work of the collective, that we're not just looking for my escapism or, just for me to be saved and then taken somewhere? But what if the work of justice is so intertwined with salvation? It's the salvation of all people, especially people who have been shoved to the margins, people who are, experiencing all kinds of harms because of the systems that some of us are more privileged and benefiting by. What if, so we talk about the work of the church. It's about, bringing people to Jesus and making sure people has their salvation. And then what? For what reason? Is it then to go, I've done my work. I am now saved and I'm going to go to heaven. That's incomplete work if the collective is still experiencing harm. So I think it is such core work for the church.
Yeah, Rosaline, what in the work that you do, how much is the church a part of, your community organising and engagement? And what do you see as the role of the church on these issues?
So actually, the organization I work for, it is a Christian advocacy organization, and our partners are a lot of different faith-based NGOs. But even in saying that, like for example, the event that I'm running in the community next week, it's right in front of a church, and I'm working closely with the church to ensure that community is present. I guess similarly to what Moy has mentioned, how do people not get involved in this, and especially in spreading the good news and the word of God? One thing that I always think about when it comes to churches is accountability. And I say this especially because I've had the privilege of attending meetings and conferences with church leaders who have signed mandates, who have participated in different decision-making dialogue circles. And they put the people at the head of the church put their name down and say, yes, our church, we are going to commit to climate justice. We are going to commit to a safer world for women. But what are they actually doing? I think implementation is really important, but working at a level where they involve community, because when it's just top down, then it's not gonna work for everybody, especially in this decolonization process. But also in saying that, it's different for me. It's about practicing what you preach, and it can be difficult at times. I'm not going to lie, especially when I do use my, my cultural elements, my way of being, as a younger person. I do try and always approach the situation with grace and with humility, because we always are told to respect our elders, but at the same time, accountability is something that is very important. And churches and NGOs that are faith-based, I believe that they should be held accountable when it comes to justice.
Amen.
So, growing up in church, I always heard stories of the good and faithful missionaries going to the Pacific Islands to convert the
heathens,
the heathens,
the pagans.
Now I'm on a call with all the pagans and the heathens, and I think this very much fits with the decolonization that we've talked about before earlier. How do we move past a missionary mindset to a justice mindset in this kind of setting? we've talked about the role of the church, but we don't want the church suddenly to simply just be sending a whole bunch of old style missionaries. How can we actually engage better in these topics? In light of all that we've discussed over the last 3/4 of an hour or so, how do we decolonize mission? We've said the mission of the church includes justice. How do we do that in a way that is non-colonizing?
If I was to go back to the book Americana and the work of the self to decolonize one's mind, which then has led to many things. Our people need to be decolonized,
Wow.
So I say that when I, doing the study with you, Nathan, but going down this real focus of our Pacific Island people need to be decolonized in their mind and in their thinking. Our churches, our Pacific Island churches, our Samoan churches in particular, still are, operating with a colonized approach. And so we cannot do the justice work when we ourselves are perpetuating some of these things and repeating some of these same narratives. And whilst and Rose, you can correct me because I feel like you are a lot more involved in our cultural practices than I am. And I say that with I try not to operate from shame, but I also say that with much shame. But the more that I am listening, I'm going to use, because I'm Samoan, the preamble of our Samoan constitution is "E wha'availea tua Samoa," which it says Samoa is founded on God. Now that is a very new thing because Samoa was not founded on the Christian God. And not to say that the God of the Christians is not the God that the Samoans prior to the missionaries was operating in Samoa, because I really believe that God was already at work, right? And so that's a whole nother conversation. So I just feel, I do think there is great work of decolonizing our own people and our mindsets and the way that we operate, to say God has some incredible ways of using our Indigenous knowledge that can be restorative, and it's a work of justice amongst our people and also within our region and our South Pacific oceans. And until that happens, I think we can talk about it. But Rose talks about climate justice within our own family dynamics. This is considered, wokeness, when, that has been so politicized, when there is great work of education and honest dialogue that needs to take place within our family circles, in our youth groups, amongst our villages. And I think that is happening, but I think it's a very slow work. I don't know. Am I speaking out of turn, Rose?
No, I'm 100% with you. I definitely agree with, there's a lot of decolonization work that needs to be done across our communities and churches, 100%. I know that in our Samoan way of being, shame is such a thing. And I've always been a little bit different in a sense with some of the things that I talk about, because I'm the type of person where I will share my whole family life story with people. For example, I have siblings. My father had children beforehand, before he met my mum. So for me, that's like, oh yeah, I've got siblings here, there. And a lot of the time when I share that with other people, they're just like, what are you talking about? Like, that's so shame. Why are you speaking these things out loud? But I've learned through my decolonization process, I have to let that go. Like, there's no point of holding on to that, that colonial way of feeling like we need to be perfect and pure every second of the day, because in saying that, that also is why a lot of the younger generation do turn away from church, even if they were, raised in that context, because they just feel like they cannot belong, especially here in the diaspora. But then another angle that I often look at, and I think because I'm blessed to have had a few mentors from the Pacific theology space, I know nothing about that stuff, but when it came to the Indigenous studies point of view, I was connected with some really great reverends, and the way that I look at it, and this is quite it's a controversial topic because not everyone will agree, but I think people often say that there's no room for culture and faith together. So they say it has to be separate. But to me, I'm like, no, it is very much woven together. And like, for example, like even in our if you go to Samoa, like there's a church everywhere you look, but even in our practices, like for example, when there's a new pastor being brought in, or when there's a wedding or something, the church is very much involved in a very beautiful way as well. Even though sometimes there are certain things like the overgiving and things like that which do need some work, but in terms of like the communal and cultural values, it's very much there, and it's a beautiful thing. So I think the way that we decolonize, we also look at, wait, this actually works, but we also need to be mindful of the colonial elements that are in that, which is like, for example, the use of giving so much money, which really wasn't what we did historically. We were very much focused on nature and giving, our plants and our mats and things like that. But we've taken what we've been given, what we've been forced to have, and tried to make it work for us. So I don't necessarily think that is our fault, but in saying that, the way we look at church needs to be decolonized.
Yeah, I love that. The both and principle.
Well, thank you for sharing with us today. I think there's about 43 different podcast episodes we could spin off from the conversation. The little things that we've just poked a little bit and that we can explore. So we could explore so much more. But certainly, I think you've given us plenty to think about, and probably a whole bunch of questions to ask and other things to reflect upon. So we're really grateful for what you've shared with us, how you've shared from your culture and your stories. That's a gift in itself, and we really appreciate your generosity. It's that Samoan generosity you were talking about that you've shared with us, and simply that there's so much to learn when we start talking about cultures and all these things, and that's exciting. I think I borrowed the line from Dilys about curiosity being such an important and valuable way of approaching the world and approaching justice conversations, because that's where we need to start, is having those kind of conversations. And so, they need to be done in a safe way and respectful way. And so thank you for trusting us with your story and a little bit of your story and culture. And thank you for what you've contributed to our wider Just Love community by this conversation.
One of the things that I learned from the both of you today is the importance of remembering our stories, reclaiming our stories, and the gift of being in community. And so I want to say thank you, and I want to invite you to teach us how to say thank you in Samoan.
Awesome. Okay, no worries at all. So I'll give you the more sharper version. So it's whaawhitai, tele, lava.
Whaawhitai, tele lava.
Yes. Yes. Whaawhitai tele lava.
Whaawhitai tele lava. We thank you for being here with us today and for giving us a window into the world of the Pacifica people. And it is our hope that we will stay curious, we will learn, we will decolonize, we will do justice.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you.
Whawhatai Tele Lava to Moy and Rosaline for sharing with us in this episode.
Nathan, I am leaving this conversation inspired, challenged, encouraged, and motivated. These Samoan women have deepened my commitment to Sawubona, that Zulu concept meaning I see you. It means to see people as whole persons with histories, legacies, and stories worth honoring. And what stayed with me throughout this conversation is something both Moy and Rose kept returning to. It's not either or, it's both and. Culture and faith, identity and justice, Samoan and Australian. These are not competing things. They are the whole person showing up.
Indeed. I think we also need some self-reflection. What feelings were stirred as you heard these stories? Who in your own region carries similar stories of invisibility or resilience, or perhaps better, invisibility and resilience? What can you do to build bridges, or at least begin some repair work?
I want to also say, Whaifatai, Tele Lava, Moy, and Rose, thank you for trusting us with your stories.
So here are the homework challenges for this episode. This week, do one intentional act of learning about the Pacific. Look up what is currently happening with the independence movements in New Caledonia or West Papua. Learn about the issues of climate change and displacement in Tuvalu, or the ongoing effects of nuclear testing and now climate change in the Marshall Islands. Share what you learn with one person. Curiosity is where justice begins.
I love that line. Curiosity is where justice begins. Thank you for joining us for episode 6 of the Just Cause podcast. Make sure you subscribe to this feed to get more episodes as they are released in coming weeks. Thank you for adding reviews where you have accessed this episode and for recommending this podcast to your friends and churches.
To discover more about Just Love Collective, visit our website at justlovecollective.org and connect with all the other good things we're doing, including our Pulse e-magazine, our fortnightly newsletter, Just Love Notes, the Just Love Book Circle, and other occasional events.
We will be back soon with another episode of Just Cause. Thank you for being part of our Just Love community.